Yeah, maybe just following up a couple of just thoughts that came to mind as Nigel was doing that intro. I've been doing a doctorate through Fuller Theological Seminary, and I was supposed to be doing a paper at the moment called Theology and Technology. I really wanted to do this paper with a guy called Dargaville. He'd been a well-known commentator at Fuller, been one of the profs in specialties, media, popular culture, culture more generally. And I was really keen to do this kind of garden-to-garden city tour of just how have humans interacted with technology. At the last minute, he had the gall to take another position somewhere else at Aberdeen College, and they had to change that paper at the last minute, and John and Olive Drain stepped in to do that paper. And that paper, John Drain's probably best known for a book he wrote called The McDonaldization of the Church, now in his 70s. And so they changed that paper to Mission and Ministry in a Digital Age. And I was kind of like, oh, that's not really, I wanted it to be a bit more meta than just what a screen's doing to us. I think what screens are doing to us is important. I'll have something to say about that today, but I sort of wanted to go a bit more sort of meta than that and really just look at technology, not just screens. I think screens are tapping into tendencies that we've always had, and we might have perfected the distraction, but I think that's always been there, and I was keen to look at some other themes. But anyway, I said, look, is there any chance I could do this new paper but still do some of the reading list of the old paper? And they were happy with that, so I'm doing a bit of a combination of both. But that's turned out actually to be a real blessing, the change, because a large amount of the stuff has been around our COVID response and what that's meant, and some of the things you were talking about, Nigel, and some really challenging stuff to hear, both as a church congregant, someone who is trying to do his best to, alongside Julia, make church something that we are invested in, that our kids are invested in, but also as a contributor too. I'm on staff just part-time. I'm about 0.2 at St Paul's Anglican Church, and I'm 0.8 with them. But one of the books that's been written around the sort of COVID response really asked a pretty searching question about discipleship. It said, a woman actually out of Texas A&U who's done a whole lot of stuff around digital platforms long before COVID came along. But she said if you asked any church leader, they would say they were committed to discipleship. And yet, as soon as COVID hit, if you then swung 80% of your resources into putting on an online program, and discipleship fell by the wayside for the last 2 years, you've got to ask yourself how committed to that you were. And I read that and was like, ding, 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 ding. Like, we more or less as a church, that we'd be guilty of some aspects of that, of actually trying to produce this thing online that would act as this kind of gathering point, but actually dropped probably some balls and didn't think as creatively as we could have. Some of you will have heard the illustration or the metaphor that's been used about church being a bit like a chess, playing a game of chess, where you've got different chess pieces, you've got different pieces in your arsenal. There'll be people in the room who play a much better game of chess than I do. If you've heard the metaphor goes that the queen, everyone knows, is the most powerful piece. The queen, you don't know anything about chess, can make any number of moves in any direction with a turn, whereas everything else is limited. Pawns can only move one forward or two forward on their first move, unless they're taking something, in which case they move diagonally, and the knight moves one across and two forward, or whatever that is, and some move diagonally, some move vertically and horizontally. But the queen can do all of those things, except the knight's move, actually. But the queen can more or less move around and do everything. And what good chess players will do, the difference between a good chess player and a really good chess player is that a really good chess player doesn't rely too much on their queen. They've learned how to use the other pieces on the board. And some of them will even play for a season without their queen. So they'll either take their queen off the table or they'll surrender it early and try to win games without their queen. And then later on, when the Queen gets reintroduced back into their game has gone up a level. And I actually preached on this about a year ago, and I wasted a lot of time on YouTube watching speed chess players doing that. And there was one guy, rather arrogantly I would say, who would surrender his queen and then proceed to just disembowel his opponent without a queen on the table. So the way the metaphor goes is that when COVID hit, we had our queen taken off the board, our Sunday services. We couldn't do the things that allow us to do so much in that time, and it's wonderful. Like we are koinonia, those who gather together. There's something about that we weren't able to do. But what the illustration was asking was, did people sit there lamenting it and trying to cobble together something like a queen in other forms, or did they use it as an opportunity to strengthen the other pieces that were on the board? And so I sort of spoke about that at our church and said, look, we are being allowed back in. We were then only allowed to meet in 100 at the time, but let's not lose what remains of that opportunity to do some of that. So I think we are in a really, really interesting time. The other just point I want to make before diving into my content, which is going to focus at the probably in the third and fourth decades, so people in their young adults in their 20s and 30s, is a paper that you actually sent through to me a couple of days ago, Nigel, which was a University of Auckland lecturer just lamenting the high price that the young have paid for COVID. He said he walks around Auckland University, and that's I did my first year at Auckland University, so I walked around some of the places he would have been walking around. He said, I walk around and I don't see the vibrancy in the student community that was here 3 or 4 years ago. They're not excited about the university experience. It's largely been robbed from most of them. And you could cut and paste that to young adults who would have been going through their second to last or their penultimate or ultimate year at high school. Opportunities that you and I got to have at high school in those final years that they just haven't been able to do. And he said, it's a little wonder that we're seeing rising anxiety, rising mental health problems amongst them. He said they've paid a high cost, the young have paid a high cost to protect the elderly with this pandemic. And he said it remains to be seen how much of that we're going to be able to recover for them. So I make no apologies today about making my focus that age group, although there will of course be things that apply whatever the age of your congregations and your congregants. So I'll dive into the first session, and I've called this Growing Resilient Disciples, and I'm drawing heavily as the handout as a clue on a book that David Shannon and Mark Matlock put out several years ago called Faith for Exiles, Five Ways for a New Generation to Follow Jesus in Digital Babylon. Is anyone familiar with that book? Just show me if you're familiar with that book. Okay. All right. Okay. That's pretty good. So I can plagiarise as much as I like, and I've only got 2 people to buy off in the lunch break. No, even if you're familiar with this book, we're going to have time for discussion. I'm going to try and use the sort of Q&R time for discussions at the table, and if things kind of come out of that, or we want to maybe ask to the room, we might have a couple of moments of doing that. But I just realised that there's a lot of collective wisdom in this room. There are people who have been ministering for 2 or 3 times longer than I have been. And so I'll use this book as our kind of stepping stone into some conversations around what churches can be doing to produce resilient disciples. A little bit about my background. Here's my family a number of years ago. In the top left, married to Julia, got 3 kids who are now 10, 8 and 6. The little redhead still has that steely gaze. I went to university, did my first year in Auckland, but did my pre-med year for Otago, and actually transferred down to Otago and studied medicine, hence the Scrubs reference, which some of you are old enough to actually know what Scrubs is. Most of the 20-year-olds I show don't even know programs. I used to, before the Top Gun remake had been even announced, I used a Top Gun reference to a room full of 25-year-olds, and just like complete silence, just a tumbleweed blowing through. Okay, I need some newer pop cultural references. So I studied medicine down in Dunedin and in bioethics. So I actually halfway through took a year off and started what was to become a master's in bioethics. And so at the end of my clinical years, which I did in Christchurch, headed up to Whangarei, worked for a couple of years, and then locumed in Australia for about 2.5 years before actually coming back to faith in Australia and making my way home and working for a church. I did an internship with Life Church in Auckland with Paul and Marie Dion, and was then a part of their Bible college and was on staff there for 7 years, and had a great time doing that. I was just saying to Ellen, just before I got married, they moved the Bible college up to Snells Beach, and I wasn't going to try to attempt a sort of an hour-and-a-half commute each way as a newly married, so I actually came off staff there and have been working ever since for the organisation that I do now. It's called the Venn Foundation, so bottom left there. We basically do discipleship programs for postgraduates. I say postgraduate, not everyone who comes through is a graduate, but we sort of pitch it at that sort of level of late university. So usually people have to come knowing that they're gonna grapple with some content, although it's much more wraparound than that. So my wife and I have been the residential hosts of our residential program for the last 10 years, and so they come and stay for 7 months in 2 homes that are just across the road from where we live, and we take between 6 and 12 of them, and they stay, as I say, they stay with us for 7 months. We do pastoral care, we have meals together, there's a lot of content. I've got some colleagues who are a lot more learned than I am, including one who's a Rhodes Scholar, a couple with PhDs, and so there's a lot of content, but it's very holistically taught. It's taught in a way, because of the residential nature, it changes the way that everything's postured, including the lectures actually. So we just know that they've just woken up together, tumbled down the hill into the lecture room, and we begin lectures knowing that they are forming this kind of fellowship or learning community together. We also do one called the vocational program, so realising that not everyone can give up 7 months and come away to live there. So that runs over about 8 Wednesday evenings and 3 block courses at the beginning, middle and end of that program. The idea being to really grapple with some big questions, really grapple with what it means for faith to infuse all of life. And so, discipleship is the sort of the term of the day. Discipleship gets bandied around a lot, but in that 10 years, we've learned a little bit about what works and what sort of doesn't. Admittedly, we've got a luxury of time, but some of the principles that I think we've come up with, we've also been able to try and apply in some other settings as well. So I'm going to be touching a bit on that. And as I said, I do point to at St Paul's Church. Some of you would have come along to the presentations that the Barna Group did with World Vision 2019. They did a study of millennials and they called it the Connected Generation, and they studied over 20,000 millennial-aged young adults from all over the globe, every continent. New Zealand actually managed to have, and it's just over 500, I think it was. Might have clipped right off the bottom of my slide. We ended up getting something like 512 in our sample size, which is actually quite good. Australasia got 1,500, Aussie got 1,000 of them, we got 500. But our sample size was 500. So sort of globally, given that it was only 20,000, 21,000, we actually got a pretty good hit rate. What they were interested in is where were millennials now who had grown up Christian, who had grown up in a Christian household. And this is what they found. They found that 9%, so this is of the Kiwis, 9% were what they called resilient disciples, and I'll describe that in a moment. 24% were habitual churchgoers, 33% were nomads, and 34% were prodigals. And this is how they describe those. So prodigals had grown up Christian but no longer identified as Christian in any way. So these are people who would say, really, I don't have a faith. Nomads identified as Christian but didn't regularly attend church at all. Habitual churchgoers identified as Christian and attended church at least once a month, but they didn't qualify as resilient disciples. And I'm about to put up what you had to do to qualify as a resilient disciple. So resilient disciples, how they defined it, and sometimes definitions aren't great, but when you're doing a survey, you're sort of forced to put things into a pithy definition. But Christ followers who, 1, attend church at least monthly and engage with their church more than just attending a worship service. So there was some other way in which they would say they were involved in their church. They trusted firmly in the authority of the Bible. They were committed to Jesus personally and affirmed that he was crucified and raised from the dead to conquer sin and death. And then fourthly, they expressed a desire to transform broader society as an outcome of that faith. So, in other words, they could give, I'd want to give a more expansive version of the gospel than just he died for my sins. I think he died so that the whole cosmos could be put to rights, but that's another conversation. But they had a version of the gospel that they assented to, and they thought that was good news to be shared, I guess is how you'd put 3 and 4. And so there you go, that's the New Zealand statistics. So 18 to 29-year-olds who grew up Christians, only 9% made those qualifications, so qualified under those 4. Now, if you're scrambling to sort of take notes, like, don't do that. I've got so many PowerPoints this morning. I think I cut it down from 150 down to about 80, so we're going to be really scampering, and some of them have got massive quotes on them. It's being recorded. You'll be able to get hold of it, and I don't mind Nigel giving you my slides if people want quotes afterwards and stuff. So you just could see some pens starting to smoke. So here's where we sit globally, and sorry that the font's so small you won't be able to see that, but that's Australia there in New Zealand, pretty close to us. So 34% prodigal, the nomads, habitual churchgoers, and resilient disciples. So what David Kinnaman and Mark Maclock were interested in was, did the churches that produced resilient disciples do anything different to the churches who didn't? So they wanted to interview the resilient disciples, interview everyone, but ask, was there anything that came through as they sifted through that sort of, in our case, 9%? Was there anything that came through as themes that weren't as present in some of the other churches? And they actually found that there were some themes that emerged. It wasn't that those other things weren't present at all in any of the other churches, but the churches who were producing a higher number of resilient disciples, or resilient disciples, tended to come from churches who were doing these kinds of things. And this is what they were. They were given an opportunity to experience Jesus, to develop cultural discernment, to take part in meaningful relationships, to be discipled vocationally, and I'll describe that a little bit more in this session, but also in the one after lunch. And they were challenged to engage in countercultural mission. And so just a bit of a definition of each one of those. So to form a resilient identity, they needed to experience intimacy with Jesus. In a complex and anxious age, develop the muscles of cultural discernment. When isolation and mistrust are the norm, forge meaningful intergenerational relationships. To ground and motivate an ambitious generation trained for vocational discipleship. And to curb entitlement and self-centered tendencies, engage in countercultural mission. So they sort of put some questions to each one of those. So in our search for identity, who am I really? At the end of it, when you get down to the sort of like, what's the bedrock I'm building my life on, an experience of Jesus. How should I live in today's world? Developing some cultural discernment. Am I loved? How related is the church? And it was kind of intergenerational relatedness was something that really came through as a theme in that. So it wasn't just that you had relationships. Often I remember going to sort of young adults events and asking a sort of a 17-year-old who their mentor was, and they'd sort of point to an 18-year-old. It's kind of like, no, I was meaning a little further down the track than them, you know. So intergenerational relationships. So harnessing ambition, what's my purpose, the vocational discipleship, and then feeling entitled, what matters beyond me, involving oneself in mission. So I'm going to go through each of these. Again, a lot of quotes, I'll read them through. It'll be a lot of information. Sorry for, it'll feel like a bit of a torrent, but we will have a chance to break and have a discussion. How long have I got before we should move into a bit of time of discussion and Q&A?
Yeah, you've got a sort of 35 minutes.
Okay, great. Yeah.
Is that right?
That's awesome. Yeah.
You know what cope that is.
Yeah.
It's good.
Okay, so experiencing intimacy with Jesus. The church has responded to the pressures of our culture by offering young people a Jesus brand experience rather than facilitating a transformational experience to find their identity in the person and work of Jesus. This is them, not me. Okay, so if anything sounds a bit harsh, this is David Kinnaman and Mark Maclock saying, here's what we've got a bit of a problem. Is because we've actually watered down Jesus to sort of suit. You don't like the taste of that one? You've got some, some of the stuff he's saying, too strong sauce, let's water that down. Rather than actually, let's dig in more deeply to that. First, we've been complicit in presenting a Jesus to compete at the same level as other affiliations and affinities. So Jesus becomes just one of the other things in your life, rather than the one who demands everything. And second way, related, we've capitulated, is to expect too little. So under each of them, and this is where the notes come in, so you'll go away with, at the very least, a summary of these. Here are what they suggested or found that churches were doing who were doing this well. So there's a couple under each of these. The first was navigating by the true north of Christ. And so in our summer conference every year, I open one of my sessions with a story. And I'll try and give a brief retelling of that story now. It's about a guy who was it was about a clockmaker in a small town in Switzerland who made beautiful clocks. And pride of place of the clockmaker's shop was an old grandfather clock that sat in the window, and it took me a long time to embed that GIF into my PowerPoint, so I'll take a moment just to admire that. You know, when the tech guy is giving you a thumbs up, you've done something right. So this would sit in pride of place, and people would often come by and just admire the clock. You know, Swiss, known for their clocks. This is the pièce de résistance of this particular clock shop. People would come by and stop and just admire the clock, and some would even set their own time off it, and would get into a bit of a habit of doing that. And the clockmaker one day realised that over a couple of weeks he'd seen the same guy come by, stop, walk across the road, pause by the clock, and then walk on. And so after a couple of weeks of this happening, curiosity got the better of him, and he actually went and then went over and spoke to the guy and said, "Oh, I see you're admiring the clock there. My grandfather actually made that clock, grandfather clock, no pun intended, but you know, this has been in our family for a long time, as has the shop. It's a beautiful clock." And the man agreed. He said, yes. He said, "But I'm not just here to admire it. I've come to actually set my own watch by it." He said, "I've got a pocket watch here, actually, that my grandfather gave me, but it doesn't keep great time. And I'm a foreman down at the local factory, and it's my job to actually blow the whistle at 6 a.m. and 6 p.m. at the beginning and end of each shift. And so, knowing that I don't want to lose time, every morning early I come by and I set my time off your clock." And the clockmaker started to look a little bit uncomfortable and sort of shuffled from side to side and said, "I really hate to tell you this, but beautiful as it is, this clock doesn't keep great time. It's pretty bad, and I find I have to adjust it quite a bit as well. And what I do is I do that every night at 6 o'clock by waiting for the whistle to blow." I can remember hearing that story for the first time, cheesy as it is, when I was about 14, and it's stuck with me to this day. And I remember as a kid thinking, I wonder how far off real time you could get just taking your cues off another clock. I guess, luckily for us, darkness would be the cue that you've got it wrong, right? Like, luckily we've got seasons that are outside of us that help us. My point being that we basically live in a cultural moment in time where there is a distinct wariness of any external reference points. We're basically told that anything that claims to be pointing to true north is to be treated with the deepest suspicion. And in fact, we go further than the clock, the little cheesy story analogy even. We're encouraged to not take our cues off anyone else, never mind it being transcendent or not. And so young adults today are having to navigate life, not only having to choose what direction to go in life, and all of us have had to face that to varying or lesser or greater degrees of paralysis that overwhelmed us as we realised that the world was our oyster and what direction to go in. But they're having to work out which version of themselves is going to go there. And they're often encouraged to manufacture that version as they go. And so you want to know why life at the moment is deeply anxiety-inducing. It's partly, I would say, not a small amount due to this. I'll have more to say about this in the second session. But you can end up in this sort of environment where you can just kind of, a bit of a pick and mix version of who you are and what you're going to believe. A self-manufactured self going on this kind of self-determined journey through a kind of a self-determined belief system. Here we go, this is from Gungle. Husband and wife Christian recording duo Gungle recently made headlines when Lisa described her husband's year-long conversion to atheism in a BuzzFeed video titled, "I Stopped Believing in God After Pastoring a Megachurch." The video highlighted the couple's spiritual evolution from faith to heretical to unbelieving and then back to belief. Excuse me. Although Lisa's own atheism lasted only a day, the faith that she and Michael have finally come to embrace looks little like historic Christianity. After stating he no longer feels spiritually homeless, Michael identified himself as an apophatic, mystic, Hindu, pantheist, Christian, Buddhist skeptic with a penchant for nihilistic, progressive existentialism. Said without a hint of an irony, right? Said without a hint of irony. It's kind of like, you just get to put anything you like in your pick and mix bag. And so we've found that being able to do this has been, deeply reassuring, actually. Confronting, yes, but deeply reassuring for the young adults who are going through our program. Second is they're given an opportunity to fearlessly ask the big questions of life. And, having grown up in churches where I felt I had bigger questions than those around me could answer, I know that feeling and I know some of that frustration. And that's not, I don't want to sort of clobber anyone with that. I don't think any one person can answer all the big questions of life. And so I think we need to, however, staff to our weaknesses or whatever that is, or find other ways so that a Philosophy 101 class isn't the first time that young adult gets to ask the big juicy question they've been wanting to ask. Because someone there will answer it, and we'll give them the time, and we'll disciple them. And so we need to find ways where and settings in which they can ask those big questions. And so we find on our program, we've just graduated 9 fellows 2 Fridays ago. There's generally 1 or 2 who are finishing the program and I don't want to say in bad shape, but they're still wrestling. Now, we don't just do a deconstructive journey, and I critique just massively deconstructive journeys. We've got a lot to reconstruct with, but not all of them have finished that process by the time they leave. And so our commitment to them when they leave is that we'll keep journeying with them as long as it takes, and that they can borrow our faith in the meantime, and we'll hold them. We'll provide a trellis that they can grow alongside, or a hammock that they can rest in, might be a better metaphor for some of them, while that process continues to happen. But they've come with some big questions, and sometimes, particularly if that involves grief or some other part of their life, we try to walk that with them. And then an opportunity to experience Jesus together. So we have times of prayer, we have times of ministry, we have times where they're encouraged to bring words for each other. So there's a charismatic aspect and angle to that, where this isn't just a heady thing, but they're coming to see that God wants to know them in some quite personal ways, and has ways of speaking to them that will be bespoke, including through their senses of humour and other things like that. There's actually, God wants to know them personally. Second is cultural discernment, and a guy called Dietrich Wagner, who did a series of photographs where he rather disturbingly projected logos onto kids. Some were live photos of kids. This one isn't. This was a wax model. But in a complex and anxious age where everything's coming at you culturally, develop the muscles of cultural discernment. A couple of things that they picked up on. Millennials have got phenomenal access to information, but alongside that, it's hard to read, profound alienation and a real crisis of authority. It's like, where do you go to? We can only need to look at the events of the last 2 years to just see the crisis of authority and of authoritative sources. And so, again, there's alongside that a profound acceleration And all of this has led to the kind of levels of anxiety that we're seeing. They pull out a bunch of statistics, and so here's one around what they call the weight of spiritual Babylon versus spiritual input. Digital Babylon is a great phrase, by the way. It's one of those phrases that makes you a bit jealous you didn't come up with it, you know, navigating how to grow resilient disciples in digital Babylon. But a typical 15 to 23-year-old, there's their estimated screen media input hours per year, 2,767, and then their typical spiritual input down there at 291 hours. That's of a churchgoer. Now, I'm not sure whether they were able to discern whether some of that was also spiritual input. Because I would say, actually, I go to my screens for some of my spiritual input. I listen to Lectio 365 app as a way of just slowing down each morning. I find if I go to reading too early, it postures me in a work mode. So I actually like the way that handing over to an audio journey with someone else actually slows me down and makes me go at their pace for the first 10 minutes, and then I can just enter prayer a bit more easily. So I'm not exactly sure, but you sort of get the picture, right? The point they're trying to make is that screens disciple. At one point on his, some of you who were at the presentations, you know, our ever-present help in time of need. You know, this is where someone will go to ask that first question. It's not the youth group leader anymore. It's gone to the screen. So in order to live wisely and well in the complexity of digital Babylon and therefore diffuse anxiety, we must build our muscles of cultural discernment, the ability to compare the beliefs, customs, values and creations of the world we live in, digital Babylon, to those of the world we belong to, the kingdom of God. And once we've made that comparison, to anchor our lives, including our use of technology, to the theological, moral and ethical norms of God's kingdom. So, some of the questions that are coming up, what do they want to know about? Sexuality, 52%, you know, had real questions around this. Technology, 50%, money, 43%. I mean, the surprise to me isn't that sexuality is first. The surprise to me is that technology and money are so close behind in terms of just like, how do I navigate these? Who's there to help me navigate the big questions I've got around how to interact with technology, how to interact with money? On the weekend, I'm doing a session with a church group around spiritual disciplines in a digital age. And I gave that talk recently, and someone said, you should just do a slightly watered down version, like tone down the Christian content a little bit, but you should just do that for, you know, St. Paul Simon Street is literally within the university campus. They're like, if you did a session like that, just open to university students, just how to navigate well, how to take Sabbaths from your devices, they'd turn up to that. They'd actually want to know, how do I navigate this well? So some of the things that they're doing, they're being educated by search engine. So how do we pass on a deep, potent, lasting Christian faith to young people in an era of moral reversalism, where evil is called good? How do we learn the habits that honour God, ourselves, and others with our bodies? The tyranny of now. How can we instill faith synchronised to the deep time of past, present, and eternal in a now only world? How do you learn just the deeper rhythms? How do you slow down long enough to even be able to do that? In the session that I'll do on spiritual practices on the weekend, I basically start with slowing down, and then silence and solitude, and then meditation and prayer, and then we get to patience and simplicity and fasting and generosity and all of the other spiritual practices. I'm increasingly seeing slowing down and silence and solitude as prerequisite disciplines to even be able to access any of the others. That more often than not, if God's got something to tell me about my impatience, he'll nudge me at a time where I've got quiet enough to listen. Sometimes he'll tell me on the fly, but often he'll thwart that. And I have spent time in denominations that sort of demand that God speak loudly because that's the pace we're going at. And sometimes God says, no, I'm going to thwart that. I'm going to wait for you to slow down. Passing the time. How can we help exiles consider their discretionary minutes each day, which actually tally up to their whole lives, as something to be redeemed, not merely passed? The first generation, and I use that term generously to include us all, because we all now are having to navigate life robbed of any micro pause or rest or micro Sabbath that we might have enjoyed before. I can still remember when I used to turn up early to a cafe, I would just sit there and wait for a friend for 5 minutes. Or if I was at the doctor's surgery, I'd sit there waiting until my name was called. Maybe leafing through a 20-year-old Woman's Weekly. But we've been robbed. We are literally stimulated from the moment we get up to the moment our head hits the pillow. And, plenty that neuroscience has got to say to that. Filtering reality, how can we live in the deeper, truer narratives about ourselves, about our word, about God's nature and his design for human flourishing? So here are some things that they suggest for that. The first one is that we can't hide away from it. We can't pretend it's not happening. And so I think that goes for millennials or zennials as well, for 20s and 30s, but also those who are discipling them. We can't pretend that these things aren't happening. So find out what's going on. Find out what the things are that they're really struggling with, or that they're really wrestling with. Anchoring and then submitting to the Bible, and I'll have more to say about that after lunch. And then thirdly, don't just engage, but prepare to engage. It's not just about engaging culture, it's about making sure that you're prepared before you engage culture. That you've built some muscle before you go in there. To instill and transmit cultural discernment in digital Babylon, faith communities and households need to become robust learning communities. One of the disappointments of the paper I've been doing, Mission and Ministry in a Digital Age, has been the almost unanimous enthusiasm with which everyone on the course has said, yeah, we need to get online more. Online's where everyone's at. It's a mission field. Go and let's do it. And so we had to do a video that would get uploaded on YouTube every week, as part of getting used to it. Now, mercifully, we could keep it private so that the whole world couldn't see it. And I say mercifully because some of them were truly terrible, including some of mine. They don't belong within 100 miles of the internet, And so I started saying, well, if it's a mission field, do what a missionary does. Do your homework. Learn the language. Bury yourself in it. Become proficient in it. Become a professional in it. Don't just dabble in it because you like the sound of it and it sounds sexy. So there's hard work to be done whenever you enter any mission field. This might sound like really hard work, they say in the book, but that's because it is. But what could be more important? This is from John Stackhouse's book, Making the Best of It, Following Christ in the Real World. In a wide-ranging study of a number of major American denominations, the Search Institute of Minneapolis determined that the most important factor in producing a mature, well-balanced and well-integrated Christian faith was not excellent preaching, worship, small group fellowship or anything else, but adult Christian education. And yet I dare say there's no element in contemporary church life that is more poorly undertaken. A sermon and a home Bible study each week cannot possibly suffice. And he's talking in North America where they actually catch a sermon in a home Bible study every week. Most of us, if we went around the room, would be like us, who are preparing sermon series, knowing that most of our congregation will catch between a half and 2/3 of it. He makes the observation a few paragraphs later that a 1-week course, if you line up to Laidlaw and said, look, over summer they're doing a 1-week course, that will cover the equivalent of about a year of sermons. So just go and commit that time to going, I'm going to do a survey of the New Testament. I'm going to encourage just my home group to join me. We're actually going to do that so that we develop some sort of muscle in that area. So we're actually starting to develop that. I think one of the things that we're increasingly doing, and there'll be some maybe some those who lead young adults or youth groups, the best thing you could probably do is to convince parents that it's not your job to form their kid. That you're never going to do in 90 minutes on a Friday something that is going to counterform what they're getting the other 6 3/4 days of the year. Parents as first formers and first educators should be on the lips of anyone leading a church. That is where these things are either being reinforced or they're not. Anyway, sorry, we're not all quiet. Sorry if that was a bit controversial.
No,
Meaningful relationships. when isolation and mistrust are the norm, forge meaningful intergenerational relationships. I won't go into detail with this, but you know, the isolated stuff, this is pre-COVID, right? So we're all kind of crossing our fingers or not, or just, you know, what are we going to see up the other side of that, as per my comment earlier on about the toll this is taking on young adults. But you know, we know from scripture, you know, or history, the fundamental relational brokenness of human beings. But they're not any easier today. We've got epidemic loneliness, digital strain, a sort of a my-sized life, and a sort of a difficulty in actually putting up with community long term when it gets hard. And again, I'll say a bit more about that in the second session. In God and church, we mistrust. Church is business, or church is hypocritical. It should be hypocritical rather than hypocritical. Weaponized humour versus earnest pastors. I just was watching some of the interactions that have taken place in our media recently, where it's really difficult to know how does one conduct that conversation in the public sphere. But there's a sort of a level of skepticism, and we've seen this play out in recent times. This younger generation has grown up in the most corporatized, in the business sense, expression of the local church since its inception. Its leaders have often acted more like entrepreneurs and showmen than prophets and shepherds. Meanwhile, churches have lost influence in their local communities. This generation is the first to form their identities and their perceptions of church amid sky-high levels of church skepticism. Now, you know, we look at some of what's played out even in our media in the last 6 months, and, you know, attribute varying degrees of fairness or unfairness to what's being said. The fact remains that's what's being projected out there, and our poor young adults are trying to sit there kind of defending it, but wondering how they do that. And so this is all the point that they're making here, that they're trying to do this in a very sceptical time towards church. They're not having their love of church reinforced in the playground at school or at university. You can bet that. So their thoughts for this: balancing our aspirations with reality. I like this line, as Bonhoeffer reminded us, we don't merely bear one another's burdens, the true burden is bearing one another. And learning how to do that. And learning how to do that when community gets difficult. The importance of emotions and vulnerability, of encouragement, of welcoming, of time, attention, sharing, listening, you know, authenticity. It's probably one of the almost like the virtue, the queen of virtues at the moment is how authentic are you, and sometimes that can be problematic actually, but they're not wanting to see a sort of distanced church. They're wanting to see openness. They want to be invited in, and they're wanting to be caught up in roles of, and they call this reciprocal mentoring, where it's not that it's kind of like, hey, I'm 22 and I've got something to tell you, but more just like, will you listen as we go? Or are you just going to lecture me every time I turn up for one of my mentoring sessions? Or are you going to listen? I was meeting with our youth pastor, our young adults pastor this week, and he said, listening's a love language to this generation. Listening is loving. And so that's what they mean by that, and I'll have a bit more to say about that. And then taking digital Sabbath, so actually encouraging those young adults to actually have some times where they do unplug. And there are fun ways to do that. We have that in our class, where there's a box that they stick their phones in at the beginning of the day, and they can pick them up at lunchtime and the end of the day. There are fines that I see groups doing, you know, first one to reach for their phone, all the phones are in the middle of the table, first one to reach for their phone buys the round of drinks or whatever it is. You know, there are ways to do that in small pockets, but also personally longer pockets as well. Vocational discipleship. So to ground and motivate an ambitious generation, train for vocational discipleship. So this is actually saying what is your sense of calling in future. Vocational discipleship means knowing and living God's calling, understanding what we're made to do, especially in the arena of work, and right-sizing ambition to God's purposes. So I'm going to draw out 3 aspects of their definition there. Understanding what we're made to do, the arena of work, and then right-sizing our ambition. But this was actually the lowest in all of the things they looked at. So of those 5, vocational discipleship was the lowest. And so among habitual churchgoers and resilient disciples, At church, I've learned how Christian faith applies to my field or interest area. Less than 2/3 said that their church had anything to say to that, and only 44% of habitual churchgoers. And then my church has helped me to better live out my faith in the workplace, only 58% of those. So those are ones who these were resilient disciple churches. Their Sunday just wasn't being adequately connected to their Monday to Saturday, just not in meaningful ways. There wasn't a validation of what they were studying, what they were doing, as though it mattered. Sometimes that was, it's just an arena for you to evangelize, which is, one, just results in clumsy evangelism, and two, is just a gross invalidation of all of the other ways in which we're called to image God. So understand what we're made to do. We do our third module. We do eight full Wednesdays. I run through a theology of vocation, of work and vocation. So understanding what we're called to do as the Imago Dei, as those called to be fruitful, increase, fill, subdue, and rule through all of creation. This Genesis mandate that's given to us, that Richard Middleton describes as, in creation of the biblical tradition. So he's taking it outside of its agrarian metaphor and saying it includes human society and culture in all of its complexity and fullness, along with our earthly environment. It's relationships. So if you're called to be a social worker, then that's an amazing place to go to be helping to bring, a foretaste of the kingdom into the present. If you're called to farm the land and do that well, it's all of these things. There's a way of just validating that for them. So understanding what we're made to do, especially in the arena of work, and this is something where oftentimes our chats around vocation, they spill out into all of the ways in which we do that. We have vocation in our congregations, in our families, personally, with how we manage our own Sabbathing and worshipping and celebration to our neighbours. But it's this blue societal square that we focus on in that 8 weeks. Because, yes, there are exceptions, but by and large, most people will spend an enormous amount of their time in paid employment of some shape or form. Those who get to be stay-home mums or dads will have a season of not doing that. Those who are under or unemployed will have seasons where that's not the case. But by and large, people need to know that their paid work matters. And that it matters for reasons that are deep and rich and actually mean something. Barna's done other research actually pointing to one of the reasons there's a man drought in church, and it is the same reason. That church just hasn't spoken to where breadwinners, and they're not just talking about millennials here, they're going right back to Gen X and boomers and even older, it just wasn't speaking to what they were doing for a majority of their time. So they just stopped coming. You can access that research through Barna. We've done a book called The Good of Work, where we wrote 4 essays that really speak to this, and it's been surprisingly popular. If you jump on our website, ven.org.nz under resources, you can find that there. We just wrote 4 really accessible essays that can form something of a small group resource or just a conversation point for people to go through there. And then lastly, right-sizing our ambition to God's purposes. Fame and success are 2 ways that Barna found millennials were thinking about their work. So they either were thinking too little of it, or they were maybe thinking too much of it. And so they had a bit of this to say. Fame has become something of a North Star for many young people. One of the random facts we discovered is that 26% of teenagers think that they will definitely or most probably be famous by the time they turn 25. This is a side effect of digital Babylon, and the allure of making it on YouTube is really strong. Success, though, is of central importance to this generation. There's a book came out recently, no, not recently, a while back, called From Success to Significance. I don't know if anyone it did the rounds. I heard a lot of people reading it, and we don't need to be significant. We've got to go from success to significance. And I'm like, yeah, but what is significance other than another way to talk about success? How about from success to obscurity? How about from success to following God wherever He leads you? and no matter what it costs you. So again, if we're not careful, we can sort of take fame and we can just loosely baptize it with a few memory verses to make our version of fame sound good. And we'll fool some people, but we won't fool the Lord. So success is of central importance to this generation. Most teens tell us their top goal is to complete their education and land a great paying job where they can make a difference. This generation is ambitious, and it also turns out that the goals their Christian parents had for them are almost indistinguishable from the goals that non-Christian parents have for their children. So he's actually saying they got that vision of the good life from someone. They didn't make it up. Teens and young adults' ambitions for career success, good grades, performance and so on, they came from somewhere. With regard to educational and vocational hopes and dreams for their children, there's very little to differentiate Christians from non-Christians. Those of us who are spiritual guides for the next generation, we must take a good long look in the mirror and see how we are making faith more difficult for growing disciples. Are our goals for the next generation more about how our kids make us feel than about what God is calling them to do and be? This is getting pretty tough. In order to raise resilient young disciples, we must become resilient older disciples. We've got to put up with our son or daughter being called into an area that may not look sexy and may not mean we've got a great story to tell at our 30, 40-year high school reunion for us, not them, you know? If our aspirations for our children and grandchildren don't reflect godly ambition, living out God's purpose in their lives, it is harder for them than it has to be. So he's saying, get on board yourself, parents, before you go accusing the millennials of having kind of goals that maybe aren't as upside down as the kingdom. Sorry, Nigel, we're going a little over time here, but I'll skip up. Is this okay?
Lunch is 10:02, so we've got you and then Q&A until then.
Okay, so we've got time at our tables to chat through some of this. Okay, great. All right. So, and the last one is practice-oriented mentoring. So some sort of mentoring that allows them to be grappling with some of the distinctives of their job. And this was something where David Kinnaman actually was really, really honest on the tour, where he said his own church, he said, I've loved my church for certain things that it's done. It's certainly helped my kids to experience Jesus. It's certainly given them some cultural discernment. He went through and he said, but vocational discipleship, he said, as a dad, I've had to do that myself. I've had to find some people who, one of his daughters wanted to go into nursing. He said, I just found a couple of great nurses who I thought were doing it well, who were godly, who had thought it through, who understood it, and I put her in touch with them, and I actually, shouted them some meals out, and they just went and hung out, and they were able to have chats. He said, I did that for my son as well, in the area that he was looking to go into, which was the sciences, I think. And so, again, it's connecting them so that they're actually thinking, not just in generalities, but they're starting to think, what does someone in this area who's some K's down the road, how are they doing this well? What does it look like? What are some of the things that I can expect? And is there somewhere to go when, some of the crap hits the fan? If I've got someone I can go to who's been probably likely been through this before. Just on that, we had someone come on our program who'd been an occupational therapist. And she was just completely burned out. And she didn't come on the program because she was burned out, but she was kind of in the moment of going, man, am I in the right place? Do I keep going in this? And so for her placement, we had her do something. She had a project to do, but the other half of her placement was we just teed up 8 different interviews with 8 people who worked in health fields. So a couple of occupational therapists, a couple of clinical psychologists, a couple of doctors, a social worker and some others, and she just sat with them and just had a coffee and just heard about how have you survived? How have you managed to stay in this place with heavy stories? She worked in pediatric occupational therapy, so you're working with some pretty damaged kids. And she just said, how are you navigating that? And just to watch in 8 weeks, just that lift off her, that feeling that she's not the only one grappling with it, was really great to see. And finally, countercultural mission. To curb entitlement, some of that I'm going to be famous by the time I'm 25, and self-centered tendencies, engage in countercultural mission. The 5th and final practice is this one. The relentless pursuit of faithful and fruitful presence in our communities by living differently from our cultural norms and trusting God to show up. Despite cultural pressures towards entitlement and self-centeredness, Christians pursue a life of sacrifice and service to others. But this isn't merely some social club for doing good. Pursuing countercultural mission means acknowledging that God's design for life is much bigger than we can imagine. So what have they done in this area? Well, firstly, they've had to take courage and to switch out the picture there. Sometimes, even on mission, you've just got to know you're going to get some knockbacks on that. Not putting safety first. And so again, he said some of that had been stopped by others not wanting them to either take time out while they were at university to be involved in something else, or there was either a safety about your future or a safety about what was actually going on. He's not saying don't be safe. Like he wasn't talking about go down on the dangerous part of town by yourself, but just sometimes safety goes to sort of like, I just don't think that's great to expose you to that. And then doing that together, working together for the sake of others. I was going to explain my initial title slide, which had two trees growing out of rock. Resilient disciples, those who are able to actually grow when there's very little culturally by way of nutrition to do it. And there were lots of images, but I chose one that had two trees. You're going to get lots of images with a single tree growing in a strange place, but doing that together, doing mission together, doing all of those things together. So I have gone a bit over time, Nigel, but I am going to pause now and give us a chance to have a chat at our tables around this. Has anything been kind of resonating for you? I'm sure there are lots of ideas. We might do that for, if we're breaking at 10 to, why don't we do that for 15 minutes, and then maybe at 1:30 if we, maybe pass the microphone around, or just get people to share some of what's come up at their tables and see if that provokes some further discussion or maybe some questions that get raised in the room as well. Thanks guys, you've done well to survive that. It's 83 slides, you've done well.
Thank you.
Repent of it. Hey, look, it would be remiss of me not to put in a little bit of a plug for. Here we go. Our residential program. If you know of any young adults in their 20s, basically some of the youngest that come would be 19, 20, right through to late 20s, early 30s. If you know somebody who's in that sort of zone of really starting to wonder how do I make sense of my life going forward, or they're in a bit of a transitional time, a bit of a liminal space, they're sort of thinking, they're asking some big questions. Not someone who's basically given up on the faith. We're a sort of we're not a resuscitation laboratory, or we're not the ER in that way. That sometimes is tricky. We'll sometimes have parents come up to us and say, "What can you do for my kid who's really all but lost their faith?" That's we find that a bit of an unfair space to put them in. Actually, where they're then with others who are really going for it. They can come with big questions, but they've got a want to be approaching it in that way. So give me a yell or just jump on our website. We're just ven.org.nz. You can look up the residential fellowship program there. All right, so I love these two little guys. Anyone recognise them? Someone in the Bay of Plenty should recognise. They're straight off the Okuba fishing. One of my mates runs a fishing magazine, Fishing in God's Own, and this was one of the ads in it. Was these little guys, salty sea dogs, bored to fish, and they just sort of get better and better as the ads go on. I think this little guy here's my favourite. That's like a deep soul right there, eh? You're sort of looking at a wise old soul trapped in a. Some of them are just a bit freaky looking, but not as freaky as doing it to your kid in real life. So about 7 years ago, I was asked by a friend to help lecture a paper that they were doing for a chaplaincy, postgraduate diploma in chaplaincy. And one of the papers that they did was based out of this book here, Human Development, A Lifespan View. And it was essentially just giving chaplains a taste of every stage of life. So sort of saying you might end up, it wasn't a specific chaplaincy course, so it wasn't saying you'll be a school chaplain or a military chaplain or a hospital chaplain, which would be very different stages of life, but essentially saying you could end up in any of those. So let's do a paper that runs you through a cradle to grave look at developmental psychology. And so it did. It looked at things that affect us in utero, from newborn, infants, toddlers, children, adolescents, adult, middle age, and then elderly, and then sort of pre-head. So actually looking at some of the things that are happening as our life begins to really wind down, and what happens in those really, really late years. And so it was that book where I first heard the term emerging adulthood used as a phrase. Has anyone heard of that term, emerging adulthood? Is anyone sort of familiar with it? Essentially, what the book covered, and they didn't do a chapter on emerging adulthood the way they had for other life stages, but what they did say was what is beginning to emerge in the literature is some consensus around a potential new life stage between adolescence and adulthood. And the first person to describe it was a guy called Jeffrey Jensen Arnett, and he coined the term, put out a paper in 2000, and he basically said that he had done his research on adolescence, and he did his PhD looking at adolescence, and then a couple of years after his PhD he landed a tenure track job, and he moved location to take that job, where he finally had a stable enough income and career path to propose to his long-term and long-suffering partner. And he sort of looked at it and goes, man, I'm 36. I'm 36 and I'm finally doing what my parents did at 21. I wonder if anyone else feels like this. And the more he looked around, the more 36-year-olds he was able to sort of high-five and say, that's been your experience. So he shifted his research from adolescence to the next 10 years. And what that turned into was this paper that first came out in 2000. When I last checked, that paper had been cited about 11,500 times in other papers. So if you know anything about the academic world, and I know a little bit about it, but I'm not called to dwell there, but that's a paradigm shifting paper. Within 4 years, he had put a book out on it around emerging adulthood. By that same time, there was a Journal of Emerging Adulthood and an annual conference of emerging adulthood. It was almost like sociologists and psychologists, the Western world over, and I'll talk a bit about that distinction, basically let out a collective yes, like you're describing something here. So I just want to read you out some of his description of this from the introduction, and then I'm going to run through the 5 features that he described in that article and has continued to comment on. In the past half-century, a quiet revolution has taken place for young people in Western society, so quiet that it has been noticed only gradually and incompletely. As recently as 1960, the typical 21-year-old was married or about to be married, caring for a newborn child or expecting one soon, done with education or about to be done, and settling into a long-term job or a role as full-time mother. Today, the life of a typical 21-year-old could hardly be more different. For the young people of the 21st century, the road to adulthood is a long one. Such freedom to explore different options is exciting, and this is a time of high hopes and big dreams. However, it's also a time of anxiety because the lives of young people are so unsettled, and many of them have no idea where their explorations will lead. This period is not simply an extended adolescence because it's very different from adolescence. It's much freer from parental control, much more a period of independent exploration. Nor is it really young adulthood, since this term implies that an early stage of adulthood has been reached, whereas most young people in their 20s have not yet made the transitions historically associated with adult status, especially marriage and parenthood, and most of them feel that they've not yet reached adulthood. It's a new and historically unprecedented stage of the life course, so it requires a new term and a new way of thinking. I have proposed that we call it emerging adulthood. That was in the introductory pages of the second edition to his book. So put the first book out in 2004, second edition 2014. I think a new one's either just come out or about to come out. And so I had read the few paragraphs in that Life Stages book and thought, man, this course is going far too fast for me to stop and pause and read up on this now, but I'm going to go back and do it. And I did. I went back, I read this book, and I was just blown away by the accuracy of the description of this time of life. It absolutely described my 20s. I could have been a poster boy for emerging adulthood. Every single one of the 5 features was alive and well. Secondly, I was reading the book at about 42, and an alarming number of the features were still present in my life at 42, so I hadn't fully emerged, clearly. And then thirdly, I realised that by definition, every single person coming through our residential fellowship was going to be at this stage of life. And so I was fascinated not only in describing it, but asking the question, how do we disciple this decade well? Like, what might it look like to be having conversations that are going to help young adults to navigate a quickly shifting new life stage? So just to give you some idea of how quick the shift has been, as late as 1970, the average age of getting married in the US was 21 for females and 22 for males, or about 20 and a half and 21 and a half. But yeah, New Zealand around about the same. So within sort of 6 months of that, about that sort of 21 and a half, 22 and a half. And by 2010, so 40 years later, that had shifted up for both males and females, but still about a year apart by 6 years. 5 years. So 6 years. 20 and a half to 26 and a half for female, and 21 and a half to 27 and a half for males. And Arnett says that's a massive shift. To shift a population, to shift the mean of an entire population 6 years over basically a generation is massive. And so he became really interested in it, and that's what sparked his research. I became really interested in it and going, how do we disciple this well? He in that introduction defends why he chooses emerging adulthood from some of the other terms. He thinks youth is just too broad. We use that in a number of ways. Pre-adulthood, a little bit like prolonged adolescence, sort of makes you feel as though there's nothing about adulthood that's begun, and yet it has. It sounds just a bit too pejorative. Some of the other terms that people have used are, again, a bit sort of mystical. The sort of Odysseus, the Odyssey years, you're on this long and winding journey, or waithood, which sort of means you're sort of somehow waiting for something to happen, but not as pejorative as failure to launch or a quarter-life crisis, which can sound really, really negative. He initially started off describing it as being 18 to 25, but he was pretty relaxed about the boundaries of it. And when it begins and ends isn't as important as the actual features themselves and the fact that it's a shared experience. So 18 to 25, that's quickly more or less meant leaving home around about 18 through to the end of that third decade. So your 20s, give or take. So I started looking at this and quickly decided that it would become my final project for Fuller. So I have interviewed every person who's been through our fellowship program, except a couple of notable exceptions. One guy did his placement in Chile, and I wasn't able to interview him, which is a very emerging adulthood excuse for not being interviewed, to be halfway around the world. And one other on our latest one who just wasn't able to take part. But other than that, my sample size is now about 40, so I'm starting to build up a picture of their experience. When I first spoke on this several years ago, we did a blog piece about it, and for the blog piece I used these guys as my picture, and I don't think I've put the name of the band up here, but the What's My Age Again should be a clue if anyone can name the band. Blink-182, that's right, well done. That's about the time she walked away from me. Nobody likes you when you're 23. My friends say I should act my age. What's my age again? What's my age again? So I'm writing this about 4 years ago. So sang the pop-punk band Blink-182 in 1999, and in so doing managed to combine two of the most common themes of pop songs, messy breakups and aging. Singing about growing up is nothing new. David Bowie warned us of changes. Joni Mitchell felt captive on the carousel of time, and Pink Floyd predicted that one day you'll find 10 years have got behind you. No one told you when to run, you missed the starting gun. And we're still singing about it. In the last few years, 21 Pilots, Adele and Macklemore have all released songs that yearn for the good old days. What's interesting about the Blink-182 song, however, is that it doesn't just focus on the joys, the challenges or the nostalgias of aging. It expresses confusion about how to even be a certain age. What is 23 even supposed to look like? and you'll see themes come through in other songs as well. Taylor Swift written a song where similar themes, like how am I supposed to even be this age? So what Arnett does in sort of the next 5 chapters of his book is he runs through 5 features of emerging adulthood. But before he does that, he actually talks briefly to 4 revolutions that he thinks have contributed to us getting here. So to move that population up by 6 years, in 40 years, what are some of the things that have gone on? These don't give an exhaustive description of why that is, but here are some things that have contributed. The technological revolution more or less meant, particularly for developed westernized countries, a lot of the manufacturing and the skilled manufacturing jobs that used to be done domestically got sent offshore. When I was growing up, everything had a made in Taiwan on it, and that changed to a made in China about 20 years ago. But there was this sort of shift of manufacturing from onshore to offshore. And some of you will be old enough to remember when New Zealand had sort of thriving manufacturing industries and all sorts of things. Electronics, cars were assembled here. Often at great economic inefficiency, one might add. And my colleague Nathan McClellan, who's the CEO of Venn, was an economist in his former life. So we've got a former economist, a former doctor, a former engineer, former geologist. So we've got covering almost animal, vegetable and mineral. But he's fond of telling the story under some of the Muldoon years of Pi Electronics building televisions in Japan and then taking them to bits to then resend them to New Zealand so that they could be remade again, just to keep New Zealand's kind of industry going. So that's enough to give an economist an aneurysm, that sort of inefficiency, that a television would be made twice just so that you could keep a domestic industry inflated. But anyway, I didn't come to Tauranga to talk about economic inefficiencies. But what that meant was there was a massive swing from work with the hands to work of the mind, work with physical stuff to work with information. And not every time, but by and large, information-based jobs require more on-site, more pre-educating before going to work. Hands-on jobs you apprentice for, but other ones you go away and you study. For information-based jobs, you go and you do your degree, or you do your diploma, or you do your something before you go and do it. You're not apprenticed in quite the same way as you are into the skilled manual trades. And so what that meant was people were having to go away and have no income. Now, some of you, if you did apprenticeships, you might say you didn't earn much better than no income, but you got something. You got enough to get by on. You got enough to maybe even be able to move out of home and things. But people who are going away to study, you either loan money to do that, or you stay at home with the folks because you're not going to earn while you're doing that. And so again, it pushed out the time that you would want to take on some of those permanent responsibilities because you weren't earning any money. So to go away and to do that training meant that was getting stalled. Secondly, the sexual revolution. Again, I've done a paper at Fuller on sexuality and ethics in Christian community. You could do a whole session on this and the effects that this had, the sexual revolution had on human behaviour. But what that meant was that people could, I'm trying to think of a diplomatic way of saying this, could enjoy the fruits of a relationship without the fruits of a relationship in that way. And so there was a sense in which one didn't have to have the depth of commitment within that. One could actually put off the age and stage at which one was going to commit in those sorts of ways, either in a marriage or it wasn't that everyone was getting married, but the sort of sense of permanency there, because we both want to be around should there be children from this relationship. So again, that's just sort of pushing out that age. The women's movement, this rosy derivative from the World War II posters, where men headed off to war, and women had to move into the jobs that guys had done. A lot of industry, a lot of physical jobs, times a lot of jobs that required hard work, hard physical work, And they did those jobs really well. They vacated them though again when the men folk came back. You know, they moved out of those jobs, men came back, and women went into, you know, back to being kind of secretaries, nurses, teachers, and waitresses. You know, sort of there was a handful of jobs that they did, but wasn't open in the same ways. And again, I'm old enough to remember the sort of the Girls Can Do Anything campaigns of the late 70s and early 80s, where there was kind of like, no, actually, you know, when we were starting to realise, no, I've got a brain, I want to have my own career as well, I want to train in something. And again, it was sort of, every time I have a bit of a moment of realising that that is news to some people, you know. I bump into people that are my sort of grandparents' age, and I went in the other day for my checkup, and my cardiologist was a woman, you know. So, yeah, no kidding, Granddad, you know, like 51% of my medical class were women, and that was 52%, I think, and that was 1992, you know. So it's been that way for a really long time. But, you know, there was that period where they weren't between the sort of the end of the Second World War and the sort of late 70s and 80s. But it's come back. And so again, when we're saying, yes, I want to settle down, I want to have family, I might even, you know, we might even decide, my partner and I, that I'll be the stay-home mum, or we'll share it or something, but first, I want to get my degree in X, Y, Z, or I want to do this, or I want to have some time being, you know, doing graphic design or something else. I want to have something that I can do beforehand. Again, you know, Arnett's not saying any one of these things did it. He's just saying the combined effect of these has been to push out those responsibilities further and further. And then the youth movement. Jack Weinberg here, we have a saying in the movement, we don't trust anyone over 30. You know, you look at a photograph from the 1930s, and all the you know, room full of 30-year-old guys, they all look about 65, you know, all wearing a kind of a hat and looking very sort of grim-faced. They all want to look older than they look. And now, a room full of 65-year-olds all trying to look 30, you know, like it's gone the other way. You're wanting to actually say, I want to stay young as long as possible. I actually don't want to take on some of those things that will... I thought I said trying in that sentence somewhere. So there is a bit of a, to do those things will actually be an irreversible acceptance that I'm becoming an adult. Now, again, I'm not saying that that's conscious for everyone, or it's unconscious necessarily, or that it's widespread, or that you don't know the exception that proves the rule, but by and large, across populations, there were all of these things were combining to push out that age of those responsibilities. So, what are the 5 features of emerging adulthood? Here they go, and I'm going to read something out from each of the chapters that he has in his book. So as I go through these, just see, you know, what maybe resonated for you. You know, I'll say in a moment, I'll stop at the end of these 5 features, and again, you can have a chat at your tables about them. This is not a description of millennials. So this is not a generational slicing. This is not saying boomers were like this, Gen X was like this, millennials are like this, Zennials are like this. This is a life stage. So this is happening in life, no matter which of those generational slicings you went through. Right. Now, boomers may not have experienced this in a widespread way. Gen X, I think, did, or certainly some of my colleagues did. I'm Gen X, and it absolutely describes my experience. Millennials are more, and Zennials will as well. In other words, every generation from here on in is likely to go through this experience unless something happens to push back those responsibilities back to earlier. Does that make sense? So we're talking about the life stage here. Okay, so the 5 features. Number 1 is, he calls identity exploration. In both love and work, the process of identity formation begins in adolescence, but it intensifies in emerging adulthood. With regard to love, adolescent love tends to be tentative and transient. The implicit question is, who would I enjoy being with here and now? In contrast, explorations in love and emerging adulthood tends to involve a deeper level of intimacy, and the implicit question is more identity-focused. what kind of person am I and what kind of person would suit me best as a partner through life. Now, some of the observations that he makes around romantic relationships, are probably the part that maps least well into Christian communities. He's not describing Christian communities. So Christian communities sometimes aren't quite going to do the same level of exploration and road testing that he's describing across other populations. By becoming involved with different people, emerging adults learn about the qualities that are most important to them in another person, both the qualities that attract them and the qualities that they find distasteful and annoying. They also discovered how they are evaluated by others who come to know them well, and learn what others find attractive in them and perhaps what they find distasteful and annoying. In work too, there is a similar contrast between the transient and tentative explorations of adolescence and the more serious and identity-focused explorations of emerging adulthood. Most adolescents have a part-time job at least at some point during high school, but most of their jobs last for only a few months at most. They tend to work in low-skilled service jobs at restaurants, retail stores, and supermarkets. Now, he's not saying that those aren't legitimate places to work for your whole life. He's just saying that usually most emerging adults aren't doing it in their adolescent years with that in mind. They may later discover, oh, actually there's more scope for this than I thought, but they tend to just go into it for pocket money, and then if they stay on, it's kind of like, oh, actually within this supermarket there's real room to progress, or there's room to progress but I don't want it. I'm just enjoying the fact that I can punch in and punch out. So he's not saying that those jobs aren't a legitimate and a valid way to spend the whole of one's life. He's just making that distinction between the work you're prepared to do as an adolescent and the work that you later want to do as an adult, perhaps. I, for one, am certainly glad that I'm not still doing the first job I ever did as a teenager. Most of the work they do in their adolescent years are unrelated to the work that they expect to be doing in adulthood, and they tend to view their jobs not as occupational preparation, but as a way to obtain the money that will support their social life. In emerging adulthood, work experiences become more focused, laying the groundwork for an adult occupation. In exploring various work options and in exploring the educational paths that will prepare them for work, emerging adults explore identity issues as well. What kind of work am I good at? What kind of work would I find satisfying for the long term? What are my chances of getting a job in the field that seems to suit me best? As they try out different jobs or university majors, emerging adults learn more about themselves, they learn about their abilities and interests. Just as important, they learn what kind of work they're not good at or they don't want to do. And so that's why I've got these kind of different hats on, different things that you try, different decisions that you make. Again, while down in Dunedin, some friends and I thought we, would try busking, see if it really took off. We might go full time, quit head school and busk. What is it they say? Almost everyone's got an album in them, and for most of us it should stay there. And so, you try these things, am I called to be a muso? No, turns out I'm hopeless. Won't do that. But you can try these things, and the stakes are pretty low. You can explore. The second feature is instability. And really, instability is the flip side of exploration. You can't explore without having some instability. You can't switch your major halfway through university without there being some upheaval to that. Just a whole new class to get used to. New laboratories that you're now turning up to, or whatever it is. There's some change that happens there. Same romantically, watching friends, Christian friends who have gone through sort of breakups, and the sometimes necessary tweaks to a friendship group that has to happen as you navigate that. It brings a level of instability to it. You will live in more geographical locations in that third decade than any other decade of your life, on average, across populations. And sometimes more than all of the other decades put together, which is probably, in my case, if I was to add up all the places I lived in my 20s, I don't think I would have eclipsed that if you added up all the other decades combined. The identity explorations of emerging adulthood and their shifting choices in love and work make this life stage not only exceptionally full and intense, but also exceptionally unstable. Emerging adults know that they're supposed to have a plan with a capital P, that is some kind of idea about the route that they'll be taking from adolescence to adulthood, and most of them come up with one. However, for almost all of them, their plan is subject to numerous revisions throughout the emerging adult years. Their revisions are a natural consequence of their explorations. They go to university and choose a major, and then they discover that major is not as interesting as it seemed. Time to revise the plan. Or they go to work after high school, but discover after a year or two that they need more education if they ever expect to make the money they wanted. Time to revise the plan. Or they move in with their boyfriend or girlfriend and start to think of the plan as founded on their future together, only to discover that they have no future together. Time to revise the plan. With each revision in the plan, they learn something about themselves and they take a step towards clarifying the kind of future they want. But even if they succeed in doing so, this does not mean that the instability of emerging adulthood is easy. Sometimes emerging adults look back wistfully on their high school years. Most of them remember those years as filled with anguish in many ways, but in retrospect, at least they knew what they were going to be doing from one day, 1 week, 1 month to the next. In emerging adulthood, the insecurities of adolescence diminish, but instability replaces them as a new source of disruption. Okay, instability. Number 3, self-focus. A bit unfair to put up a picture of Narcissus here. Excuse me. Self-focus doesn't necessarily mean selfishness or self-absorption, although it can be. And again, we need to take seriously the challenge of Matlock and Kinnaman in the book. You know, part of that is to actually think outside of ourselves, for it not to be so self-focused. But what this means is there's no time of life that is more unencumbered by the needs and the demands of other people, where this is the decade of life where you're the least answerable to others. There's no time of life that's more self-focused than emerging adulthood. Children and adolescents are self-focused in their own way, but they always have parents and teachers to answer to, and usually siblings as well. Nearly all of them live at home with at least one parent. There are household rules and standards to follow, and if they break them, they risk the wrath of other family members. Parents keep track, at least to some extent, of where they are and what they're doing. And although adolescents typically grow more independent than they were as children, they remain part of the family system that requires responses from them on a daily basis. In addition, nearly all of them attend school, whether they like it or not, and there, teachers set the standards and monitor their behaviour and performance. By 30, so fast forward, skip that decade and go to 30, a new web of commitments and obligations is usually well established. At that age, the majority of North Americans have married and have at least one child, so there's a new household with new rules and standards. There's a spouse instead of parents and siblings with whom they must coordinate activities and negotiate household duties and requirements. A child to be loved and provided for who needs time and attention. By age 30, most Americans usually have a first job that they will remain in for at least 5 years. So they have an employer and a job in a field that they're committed to and want to succeed in, who holds them to standards of progress and achievement. It is only in the in-between years, during emerging adulthood, that there are few ties that entail daily obligations and commitments to others. Most young Americans leave home around 18 or 19, and moving out means that daily life is much more self-focused. What to have for dinner? You decide. When to do the laundry? You decide. When or whether to even come home at night? You decide. So many decisions, and those are the easy ones. They have to decide the hard ones mostly on their own as well. Go to college, work full-time, try to combine work and college, stay in college or drop out, switch majors, switch colleges, switch jobs, switch apartments, switch roommates, break up with boyfriend, girlfriend, move in with boyfriend, girlfriend, seek someone new, and if so, how and when. Even for emerging adults who remain at home, many of these decisions still apply. So, that's the third of the features, self-focus. Number 4 is feeling in between. This one is entirely subjective. So it is the sensed experience of the emerging adult themselves. And what Annette found was that if you ask emerging adults at different age ranges within that decade, do you feel you've reached adulthood, you'll get a change in answer. 18 to 21, 22 to 25, 26 to 29. Now, very few people say an outright no. Okay, so only 6%, 7% of 22 to 25-year-olds, and only 2% of 26 to 29-year-olds. Do you feel you've reached adulthood? No. But the interest is in the other two answers. One is an unambiguous yes, and the other is a sort of a in some ways yes or in some ways no, or some of the time, or what do you mean by that question? You know, that's sort of an answer. And so what you can see is quite a nice kind of gradual increase from about a third saying an outright yes to 2/3 by the end of adulthood. And basically the opposite, 2/3 saying in some ways yes and in some ways no, dropping down to a third. So if you put that up on the side, you can sort of see that's quite nice. Now, so you've still got a third of 26 to 29-year-olds saying, in some ways I do and in some ways I don't. You know, I've now been made sort of head of my team at work. I'm in charge of 5 people, but I had ice cream for dinner last night. What does that sort of make it, you know? I certainly know Mum's not doing that wherever she is, you know, so I'm not Mum yet. Now, Andrew and I have had a conversation about this, where Andrew, in the past, but, you know, there's more work I'd love to do, you know, along with the million other things we'd all love to be spending more time looking at, but looking at rites of passage, you know. Spot the odd one out. We just don't have anything really by way of rites of passage that call people into the adult community, into the community of adults, into the company of adults. I've heard other commentators talk about what it felt like to go through one's bar mitzvah and to be invited into conversations with the adults after that, or to be invited increasingly into that world. Now, we might say, well, bar mitzvah happens at 13, that's pretty young. But Andrew had a fascinating conversation with somebody just a couple of weeks ago who did this for the 3 of his kids, and actually did a weekend away with other families in their community. And they, over a whole weekend, they just did a range of things that called their late teens into the company of adults. And so the boys went away together, and they did something together. They did a sort of a slow-cooked Texas barbecue over sort of, you know, 10 hours together, and the boys all got given their own barbecue set that was engraved by their dads. Now, I'm not saying that all boys have to be doing barbecuing, right? Like, there was something that suited these particular guys. They had a letter that had been written by their mothers around what it meant to be a woman, and what it looked like to be treated well as a woman, that they read and then had a chat with their dads about. They had a time of prayer together. They were intentional about something that called them into the company of adult. Now, I'm not saying that you won't still feel like you're an adult in some ways yes and in some ways no, but I do think we've got work to do as Christian communities about how we can actually help people feel like they're entering into the adult world. So the reason why so many emerging adults feel in between Arnett writes, is evident from the criteria that they consider to be most important for becoming an adult. Their top criteria are gradual, so their feeling of becoming an adult is gradual too. In a variety of regions of the US, in a variety of ethnic groups across social classes, in studies using both questionnaires and interviews, people consistently stated these as their top 3 criteria for adulthood: accepting responsibility for yourself, making independent decisions, and becoming financially independent. These big 3 criteria, he says, are incremental rather than all at once. Consequently, although they begin to feel adult by the time they reach 18 or 19, most of them don't completely feel adult until years later. These things happen gradually, and so too does the feeling of being adult. By their late 20s, they've become confident that they've reached a point where they're accepting responsibility, they're beginning to make their own decisions, and they're becoming financially independent. The big 3 have been found to be prevalent not only in the US but around the world, and I'll say something to this a little bit later. And so the last feature, and then I'll get you guys talking at your tables, is called Possibilities and Optimism. It won't be the end, Nigel. I will have a part 2 to this, but it's just to talk about these features. So we don't have to talk right through to the end from now. Possibilities and optimism. Emerging adulthood is an age of possibilities. where many different futures remain possible, where little about a person's direction in life has been decided for certain. So he combines these two, and I'm going to find it interesting to see whether COVID dents the optimism somewhat, actually. But it's a time of life where you haven't burnt any bridges permanently or irreversibly. The world is still your oyster, or whatever other metaphor we'd want to use, right? You can still, even if you've trained in this, you can say, you know what, I'm not enjoying it, I could go back and retrain. I don't yet have hungry mouths to feed. I can survive on baked beans for another 2 years. I'm going to go back and retrain. You know, there is still, the possibilities are still open. Emerging adults look to the future and they envision so there's the possibilities, but there's also a remarkably robust optimism. And other commentators have said that it's kind of surprising that sometimes, despite some pretty obvious evidence to the contrary, most emerging adults have got a really optimistic version of what their future is going to be. It's probably tied into the one in four of us is going to be famous by the time we're 25, right? He says it tends to be an age of high hopes and great expectations, in part because few of their dreams have been tested in the fires of real life. He's got a bit of a dry sense of humour in it, so I quite like this sentence. Emerging adults look to the future and envision a well-paying, satisfying dream job, a loving, lifelong marriage to their soulmate, and happy children who are all above average. The dreary dead-end jobs, the bitter divorces, and the disappointing and disrespectful children that some of them will find themselves experiencing in the years to come. None of them imagines that this is what the future holds. And I would say, well, that it doesn't, right? Like, who wants to sit there in their emerging adult years thinking that they're going to, have a job they hate, get divorced, and have sort of disappointing children? But there is a failure to name reality and a sort of a looking at something that can be amazing, and if it's not amazing, I can just change and make it amazing, that is remarkably sticky, actually, and can become paralysing. And some of us in the room will have known emerging adults who are sort of paralysed by that vision that they're holding up, where an average life just isn't going to cut it. It's hard to explain sometimes that not everyone by definition can be north of the middle of a bell-shaped curve. That's what produces a bell-shaped curve. And I've just had to get used to knowing that I'm nestled right there in the middle, and that's going to be fine. And Simon Cowell's not going to give me the call up. I've had to let that go. But what Arnett points to, but himself doesn't have the resources for explaining why, is that, just like we said before, emerging adults are only mirroring what they see around them. So he says this, 82%, this was the highest of the 5 features, 82% of emerging adults agreed with the statements for this feature, that my life's going to be great and I can pretty much do anything. But he said, incredibly, 77% of 44 to 65-year-olds also answered yes for all of those questions. And he says in the footnotes, in what is probably one of the understatements of the book, how adults at those ages can believe that, for example, anything is possible when most of them are married, have kids, and a stable long-term job. This is certainly worth exploring in future research, you know? So he's like, how someone in their mid-50s can say anything is possible when you've got deeply rooted commitments to family and vocation. He's like, it's just an anomaly. And it's really one of the kind of the emperor's new clothes myths that we all like to entertain as a culture, that regardless of our commitments, we could do anything if we wanted. He's like, emerging adults are only parroting what wider culture is trying to keep alive as a myth. Or in your mid-50s, you do that and you wreak havoc. So just as I transition out of the pastoral care team at Life, and into the work that I have been doing with them, we had 3 months up and left their families that we were having to deal with in their late 30s or early 40s. Just, I haven't had a chance to explore as an emerging adult because I did get married at 21 and I'm off to do it now. So I'm like, if they think it's a time of possibilities and optimism, by all means do it now, don't do it. Don't do it later on, because they're just carnage for their families, the wider community, trying to do that. So yeah, anyway, I've said enough. Time for you to have a chat at your tables, again about these 5 features. What has resonated with you on the way through? What examples have you seen? Maybe pushback on it. We'll do a roving mic a little bit later. This period of your life, 2, time of exploration, 3, time of confusion, 4, time of experimentation. And so you basically answer those questions and then they plot the results. And so the first group that I did this with, these were their results. So if 3 is a positive and 2 is a negative, then above 2.5 means that you're scoring positively for that feature. That makes sense. So this one here is about 3.2, identity explorations. Instability was the lowest, 2.8. Self-focus, 3.2. Feeling in between, 3.3. And possibilities optimism, 3.1. So I was kind of like, oh, there were only 6 people that went through on that program, but I was like, okay, well, at least they're sensing these features. I wonder what Reifman's original cohort showed. Well, that was his original cohort. And I'm like, oh, I'm actually quite happy with, even though N only equaled 6 for my thing, I'm quite happy with that. The next year we had another group go through. There was 7 that time. And then we had a group of 12. And again, I was like, oh, I'm actually quite happy with how this is being grouped. So to your question earlier, this is North America population writ large. I'm Sam Bloore and his colleagues' tiny Venn program in Hillsborough, New Zealand. But I'm like, I was interested, are Christian young adults experiencing this the way it's being described in the wider literature? And so by the time I did last year's one, I was like, a combination of this plus the interviews I was having with every one of them, I was pretty comfortable saying they are experiencing this the same way. So I'm going to have to come back in a couple of years and give you so what are my takeaways from this and what's going to help. But I thought just maybe in a closing couple of minutes, Nigel, if I maybe just take 5 minutes to run through some of what we're discovering is helping navigate this decade of life. And I'm going to draw it a little bit and kind of repeat or echo some of the themes from this morning. So the first thing that helps is conversations like this. So almost every time I speak on this, somebody will come up to me afterwards and just say, man, it's such a relief to hear you name this, that I'm not the only one, that it is quite widespread, that other people are doing it. Usually followed by, can you do it again tomorrow night and can I bring my mum? That will get her off my back. Or that well-meaning auntie that asks me every Christmas whether I'm slightly lost, you know. There is a feeling of actually being validated in it. They're kind of like, I'm not just being useless, I'm not just slow to make my mind up or non-committal. Like there is something about this that now is part of the way we navigate life. You know, as populations, you know, and we just heard from a pocket where there are some things at play which make that not be the experience. So a couple of things that might help. I've just called this a biblical anthropology, stability, service, and saints and exemplars. I won't go into a biblical anthropology. We talked about this a little bit when we talked about the mandate that's been given to us. But essentially, an anthropology that starts with God and not the other way around. That God precedes and supersedes us in every way. I will read out this quote from Glenn Harrison. He wrote this in a book called God, Sex and Human Flourishing. It's called A Better Story. He's a psychiatrist in the UK. Just be yourself. This is more than a suggestion, it's a promise. The modern clarion call to authenticity, being true to the self within, markets the prospect of a stronger, more durable sense of core identity. It's about freedom and flourishing, and as a result, we are more obsessed than ever with questions of identity. But has the revolution delivered on its promises? In today's world of self-expression, is it getting any easier to be, quote unquote, me? There's no simple agreed definition of identity, but for our purposes, I take identity to refer to the inner core that allows people to move between different social roles while retaining a sense of being one and the same person. It's the story we tell ourselves about ourselves, the inner narrative that gives a sense of meaning and coherence to our lives. On the face of it, the modern project of self-construction offers exhilarating new freedoms. Contemporary culture places before us a smorgasbord of options for self-invention, and when we grow tired of one option, we simply choose another. And why not? Well, the problem's obvious. Well, obvious for a psychiatrist. In a world of limitless choice and endless possibility, with no guide or map to provide us with an external point of reference, how do we choose between competing realities? As we look within, which facet of experience will help us decide today? Should we follow this fleeting thought or that whim? Should it be this feeling or that impulse? Or perhaps it's all about getting in touch with one's inner hero. But what if your inner hero turns out to be elusive? What if the self you discover within turns out to be a rather weak, vulnerable and dependent thing? And what if your suspicion grows that the notion of your inner hero itself has simply been marketed to you and you swallowed it hook, line and sinker? So this is someone who's just seen an absolute kind of tidal wave of anxiety, as I showed you before, young adults are being told not only to choose what direction to go, but what version of themselves to go there. So we have found on our program that it actually is helpful to name some things about them. And I've purposely not put up a scriptural thing of naming. You know, we all know that your identity is hidden in Christ, and you're his and he's yours, and they do a whole module on who is Jesus Christ for us today, and many of them find it deeply helpful for their identity. But it's also deeply helpful when we bring in a clinical psychologist and they tell them that you're an extrovert. And you were born an extrovert and you'll die an extrovert, and that won't change. It's actually something that's hardwired about you. Now, I don't want to get into the theology of Myers-Briggs. Two of my siblings are clinical psychologists, so I can defend it. But my sister has specialised in the Myers-Briggs system, and she says, don't base your hatred of it on that $10 version you did on the internet. When you're walked through it by someone who knows what they're doing, it can be a really powerful tool. And she's convinced that introversion and extroversion don't change throughout life. That you won't get more comfortable. You can get more comfortable being in situations that require extroversion or vice versa, but you won't change the one that naturally comes to you. You will either be more predominantly an external processor or an internal processor, and that won't change. And so my wife won't say anything until she's thought it through and it's, firm in her mind. I will start sentences not knowing whether that means. In fact, looking for you for a bit of guidance as to how the sentence should be. And that hasn't changed in the 10 years of our marriage, even though some of our behaviour around it has had to. So they find that just deeply, deeply calming to know that there's something about them that won't change. It actually puts to rest some other deep questions that they have, to know, I can actually relax into that. That's been bestowed on me. We're at a cultural moment in time where it's unacceptable to have anything bestowed on you or to inherit it. You've got to self-manufacture it. And so to actually talk of some things that have been bestowed, it is deeply, deeply comforting. Okay, I'll race through these. Stability. So stability is just simply looking for some things that can anchor you at a time where all else is unstable. Jules and I had only been doing our job a couple of years when we realised that our little place out there at 18 Cape Horn Road in Hillsborough was starting to be a place where some of the fellows would return to. And partly it was just to catch up with us or to have a beer, but we realised that at a time that was unstable, and many of them had been up and down the country since we last saw them, or overseas, that our little family unit, it stood for something that they didn't have. They could come back down this familiar street and have a beer on the same deck that they'd had a beer on for 7 months, and it was still there. And this family was still there. It represented something. So a question that I've started to ask is, what are some small ways that you might begin to introduce some stability into your life? That previous quote was just a long quote from one of them who said, when she headed off to university and changed this and that, she decided to stay at the same church. That was the one thing she was going to keep the same. And she said it was tough, there were much cooler churches, she was at university hearing about all these phenomenal youth groups, but she said it was great actually to be known in those years where everything else was changing. So what are some small ways that you might begin to introduce some stability into your life? What's one thing that can be a marker for that when these other things are changing? Because they should be changing. You should be getting those degrees and doing those things, or starting that apprenticeship, or moving down country to take that promotion and doing those things. But what's going to be a marker of stability in that time? The third one is service, and this kind of is tied in with stability. But again, I won't read through these long quotes, but here was someone saying they moved town, they were going along to a church, they were regular there, but they realised they could not attend and no one would know. So they took on leading a small group of girls. And they said, I might have stayed up all night doing an assignment, I might not feel like going to church, but that group of 11 and 12-year-olds are going to be missing out if I don't turn up. I've got to be there. So find somewhere where you can serve and you're going to be missed. Now, service has had a bit of bad press, and so I want to acknowledge that and say that that we need real wisdom around how that's being deployed. This was actually generated from her not being told what to do. There was no sort of heavy-handedness to it. But I think we can talk about that. I think we can actually challenge people and say, if you're not feeling connected, find a place somewhere within the wider community. It doesn't have to be within the four walls of the church. It could be a program elsewhere, but somewhere where you can begin to have that as being one of the anchor points. And then the final one, I'll close here, is saints and exemplars. So looking to people who can be saints and exemplars. And I use those two words. Saints, I've been mentored by people who have been dead a long time. Is it C.S. Lewis who said, for every book you read by someone who's alive, read a book by someone who's dead. A lot of good people have gone before us, and we should be being mentored by afar across the years. But also exemplars. We need people in our world who can speak to us, who can eyeball us, who can hear our confession, who can be that place of encouragement and of challenge, and they're a flesh and blood person, and develop that sort of relationship. And so I'm going to skip a bunch of slides, but just to say two areas where I think this is really, really necessary. We've talked about vocation and job, but also I think in the area of relationships, and just sort of sex and sexuality, and particularly singleness in general. I think every other area of life, young adults within church are looking out at culture, and at least other young adults in culture are also admitting that they haven't got it all together. No one's adulting very well. Adulting's become a verb now. Who's adulting well? Not me. But in the area of sort of sex and relationships, the message from culture is that they've got it all together. And I think young adults can feel very sort of naive at times, or as though they should have it all together and they don't quite know how to. And we've found if we've opened up the door to talk about that, they've just thrown it right open, and they'll talk and talk and talk about this. I think we need to do a far better job of incorporating singles into church life and doing that well. Singles used to be venerated, and now they get our pity. I was single in church until I was 36, and I had almost every patronising thing said to me in that time. And so I think we need to do a far better job of actually truly being a family together and gathering in ways that aren't token, but are doing life in that way. I've got got to say, it's not just at that end of life. My mum's been widowed 12 years and she says they don't do it any better at that end of the spectrum either. So we've got a bit of work to do in those areas. So look, those are sort of a few areas where I'm starting to see there's room for us to be doing some of that work. Still got plenty of reading and stuff to do. Nigel, I'll hand back to you. Thanks for your forbearance. And,